Well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Sandra Mason-Hicks, and I'm the coordinator of the Municipal Solid Waste Initiative of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to reduce short-lived climate pollutant, also known as CCAC. I'll be the moderator in today's webinar. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about how to stimulate correct recycling behavior. For your information, this webinar will be recorded. This webinar, like other webinars hosted by the MSW initiative, are geared towards helping cities improve their waste management and should reduce short-lived climate pollutants. The initiative is working with its partners to help cities address the waste challenge that generates methane and black carbon. As you can see in this slide, there are proven solutions to these challenges with multiple benefits. One of the solutions is a diversion of organic waste, and this will require a change in behavior, so this can be achieved, which is the topic of today's webinar. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Jenni Downs. Jenni Downs is a senior research consultant at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. She has over 10 years of experience in applied social research with a focus on evaluation and research to develop effective strategies for household-level, organizational, and society-wide change towards sustainable futures. Jenni's passion is resource use and waste, and she leads the Institute's work in project design and evaluation in this space. In this webinar, Jenni will explore why it can be so hard to change people's waste and recycling behaviors, drawing on insights from the emerging fields of behavioral economics and psychology. She will then present emerging strategies and tactics that municipal authorities and others can implement to improve recycling behaviors. After the presentation, there will be time for a Q&A session. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions by typing your questions in the chat dialog box. You may also send in your questions at any time during the presentation. The presenter might answer some questions during the presentation if needed. Otherwise, we'll collect all the questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. With that, I will go ahead and give the command to Jenni so we can go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Sandra. Let's see. I think that is right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. I'm really pleased that Sandra invited me to present today. This is a presentation that I gave at a recent summit here in Sydney, Australia, and it's really, I guess, drawing together a lot of the research that we've been doing on behalf of our municipal authorities here to help particularly with dry recycling, dry recyclables, paper, plastics, glass, metals, in households, because that's a particular issue right now with the China restrictions, but it really does apply to any sort of waste or really any sustainability behaviour change. So just to introduce, I do work at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. We're a research consultancy at the University of Technology, Sydney, and we work across a broad range of areas around sustainability, and we, I guess, work with our clients to help them with the challenges that they're facing so that we can create change towards sustainable futures. And as part of that, we really recognise the role of the Sustainable Development Goals and their comprehensiveness. And so we've actually mapped our research across the areas to understand where our current actions lie and to help, I guess, prioritise going forward. Our research crosses all of the 17 goals. So today I'd like to talk about 3 things. And the first one is understanding what behaviours we're actually trying to change, then looking at why it's so hard to change some of these behaviours, and then introducing some of the ways that have been, I guess, starting to be tested, new ways to change people's behaviours. So to begin with, really I think it's always important to understand what particular behaviours do we need to change. And that might seem quite simple. You know, we're talking about recycling, then we want to change recycling behaviours. But what particular behaviours are we actually interested in? This is really important because the research suggests that change is much more effective when you know exactly what behaviours you're trying to change and you focus on just one behaviour at a time and understand the barriers to that behaviour, to the behaviour that you want, and the things that are keeping the undesired behaviour in play. So when you're talking about recycling behaviours, there's actually a whole range of behaviours that impact on the materials that households actually have to throw out. And these range right from the beginning when people acquire products and goods in their house, when they're using them, what they're doing to hold on and maintain them, different ways that they use to get rid of them when they no longer want them, or when they're actually not usable, how they basically rid themselves of unwanted items. And we are really looking today at recycling, but it's really important to understand that actually all of these behaviours can contribute to what is in or not in people's bins when we go to collect them from the curbside. But so we are talking about recycling, and I guess what we consider recycling to be really is a question of waste sorting. What we want to do is we want to get recycling out of the rubbish bin into the recycling bin, and we want to get rubbish out of the recycling bin into the rubbish bin. It's basically a question of which bin should people put a particular item in. But it should always be kept in the context of reducing waste in the first place. In Australia particularly, there's quite an attitude that says, oh, it's okay if I throw this out because it's getting recycled. And that's actually, you know, quite I guess a perverse behaviour, because it's actually encouraging the increase in waste rather than the reduction. So when you're talking about recycling and creating engagement or education or behaviour change programs around recycling, it's still really important to put in the context that recycling is kind of a last line of defence against waste and against landfill, but there are other behaviours, like we saw on the previous slide, that we could also be doing to reduce the amount of rubbish that's created in the first place. So knowing what behaviour we're trying to change which bin people put particular items in. It's important now to think it's quite simple behaviour. Why is it so hard to get people to change, to understand what products do and don't get recycled, and which bins they should go in, so that they're not either putting out to landfill precious resources that we could be recycling, or placing contamination into our recycling bins that can actually reduce the quality of the recycling that we can get out of these. So one of the places that we start with our research when we're working with local municipal authorities is what are the barriers to effective recycling behaviours. And it's interesting that our local councils often do a bit of research around this. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that when they ask the people in their areas why people don't recycle, the first reason cited by the majority of people is laziness. They say people don't recycle properly because they're lazy, or people don't recycle because they don't know what's recyclable. But actually the research into why people aren't getting the right things in the right bin actually suggests that these are not necessarily the main reasons people aren't recycling. In fact, there's a bunch of other things going on. It could be the habit, which we'll look at shortly, about what they're used to doing, the inconvenience that can come from recycling. If, for example, you're on a system where your rubbish gets picked up weekly, but your recycling only gets picked up fortnightly, and you're looking at things that you might consider to be a bit unhygienic because they have food residue, you might not be putting them in the recycling bin because you don't want them to sit there for 2 weeks. And if you put them in the rubbish bin, you could be getting it out of your house within the week. There's also a lot of really complex products out there, products that are composite. They're actually made from multiple materials like plastics and paper, or perhaps they're made from compostable plastic, but they look like recyclable plastic. And there's also this, I guess, this kind of tendency that when we see other people doing the wrong thing, we're more likely to do the wrong thing also. It's called broken window syndrome, comes from kind of the crime space. But basically when people see other people around them not doing the right thing, or they even just think other people around them are not doing the right thing, it tends to reduce their motivation to do the right thing. So taking that into account, one of the interesting things is that traditional behaviour change programs that we see, particularly my experience in Australia, has been that they kind of operate on this kind of simple kind of idea of behaviour that says, behaviour comes from, people's awareness of a particular issue, their knowledge about how to do it, motivation to act in a particular way. They set an intention and then they follow that intention through into behaviour. And traditional behaviour change projects, I guess, operate by providing information that, increases people's awareness and knowledge and motivation, with the idea that this will then lead to behaviour, the behaviour that they desire. And what we find when we evaluate these projects is, in fact, giving information to people does increase their awareness. They do report higher motivation to do a particular behaviour. They know more about what they should be doing. They even sometimes set intentions, even verbally, in these projects. But does it actually lead to the final behaviour? And in Australia, we're quite hampered by the fact that the cost of data collection for waste and recycling is actually really expensive. Here in Australia, the process is people literally go around and collect the contents of bins, and they go to a warehouse and they tip the contents out onto the floor and they sort them into the different piles and they weigh them to see how much of each material is in a bin. And to do that at scale is a really expensive undertaking. And so a lot of programs actually stop here. They operate on this sort of assumption. They provide information and they check with people that the program has actually increased awareness, knowledge, motivation and intention, and they make an assumption that therefore the behaviour is increased. But the research that does actually go to that next level and look at what the impact on the actual behaviour is and the contents of the bin often finds that actually, despite all of these things increasing, the behaviour itself is not improving. And this is borne out by the majority of councils in Australia at the moment have been facing this challenge whereby recycling has been increasing quite steadily over the last 40 years since it was introduced here in Australia, until about the last 5 years, where our recycling rates are kind of plateaued. It's like we've kind of reached the limit of what people are and aren't prepared to recycle, and we don't seem to be making much traction. And it's called in the literature behaviour gap, a gap between people's knowledge and behaviour, or between their motivation and behaviour, between their values and behaviour. And there's a number of reasons behind this behaviour gap, while you find this gap between all of these things and what we're hoping. But one of the key reasons that's starting to emerge is the idea that recycling behaviours are actually what's called habitual behaviour, something that we do every day, placing things into one bin or the other. And it's, for most people, it's a fairly unconscious and automatic behaviour. And why that's important to know is because research coming out of the field of neuroscience suggests that our brain actually has two different systems that it operates in. And the first system is what's called our fast system. For those of you who are familiar with, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, this is really, I guess, drawing on that field of work. Our system 1 brain is very fast. It does all of our everyday decisions, largely unconsciously, quite automatic. But what it means is that it's actually error prone. And it really draws on a number of things. What we've done before, what's top of mind right at the moment that we're undertaking that behaviour, what we see around us, and general rules of thumb that we use to make decisions, which are called heuristics. Our other system is our system 2, is our slow and conscious brain. And this is particularly where we are making complex decisions, where we actually stop and we actually put conscious thought into processing and working our way through a decision. And when we're doing this, we often do reference our knowledge and our beliefs and values. But the difficulty for behaviour change, particularly around things like waste and recycling, is that people are generally actually operating in this system. And when people are in system one, what the research is starting to show is that these things about what we've seen around us recently, whatever we've just been thinking about today, whatever we did the very last time we stood in front of the bin, is what actually guides our decision making. And often when we're in system one, we don't even access the parts of our brain where we store knowledge or even our values. And so this makes it really difficult when we're trying to change behaviour if we're adopting that sort of information-based approach, giving people information that they store in their kind of knowledge centre. But next time they're standing in front of the bin, they're not accessing that knowledge when they make the decision. And it's quite interesting, I guess, to understand this distinction and particularly how this system one is error prone. And there's a number of really quite fun quizzes that you can actually find out if on the internet if you go and sort of search for fast brain, slow brain kind of quizzes or things like that. But I'm going to try one. I've never done it on a webinar before. Try one on this webinar, which might help us see if we can actually see our own fast brains in action. Okay, so the way this quiz works is, let's say that tomorrow your toaster breaks and you need to go and buy a new toaster. And you might, kind of get on the internet and go search for a toaster. And you might find this toaster for $100. But while you're looking, you actually realise that there's another toaster and it's only $50, but it's about a 20-minute drive away. So my question to you is, if you could save $50 by driving 20 minutes, would you? And to help us out, Sandra, are you able to bring up the poll? So just quickly, off the top of your mind, no judgment back to you, but would you drive 20 minutes to save $50 or £50 or €50? So can we see the results of that poll? There we go. Okay, so about half of us said, yep, we would drive 20 minutes to save $50. Now, interestingly, and maybe it's a function of the currency difference, but in Australia, it'd be about 80% of people would say, sure, yep, I'd drive 20 minutes to save $50. But so remembering that, the next question I have for you is, if we can come back to my screen, great. Say next week, actually it's your TV that dies and you get online and you need a new TV and you can find a TV that's $3,000 or, $3,000 of your own currency. While you're looking, you realise that you can actually, there's another TV, it's only $2,950, but it's a 20-minute drive away. And now the question is, if you're going to pay $3,000 or $2,950, would you bother driving 20 minutes to save $50? What we see here, and this is repeated over and over again when we look at this, is now the majority of people would not drive 20 minutes to save $50. But just stop and think for a second, because the two questions I asked you was, would you drive 20 minutes to save $50? Or would you drive 20 minutes to save $50? The difference is how much the product is compared to $50. So when $50 was half of the price of the toaster, more people were willing to drive 20 minutes to save $50. But when $50 is only a fraction of the cost of the TV, a lot less people are willing to drive 20 minutes to save $50. But actually, it's still just $50. If $50 was worth 20 minutes tomorrow, why is $50 not worth 20 minutes next week? And this is a case where our brain is not operating rationally, because $50 is $50 is $50. But the context in which we make the decision changes how we feel about it and the decision that we actually make. And that sort of framing and other things that affect our decisions, cognitive biases, basically, ways that our brain makes decisions, snap judgments based on the information that's presented to it at the time, but it leads to these unusual outcomes, which, you know, from the outside might seem quite strange. Like, for example, when you've told people that one of the problems that we have, nappies are not recyclable, yet people keep putting nappies in the recycling bin. Why is this happening? And it comes down to this fast brain thinking. So, and you can, there's lots of research around cognitive biases and around the heuristics that people use. A number of organisations, particularly in the behavioural economics field, that have been producing guides to tap into what those different insights are into people's behaviours and different ways to, I guess, apply them to your work to change behaviours. But what's interesting is that a lot of the work that we're seeing, particularly coming out of the UK and the US, is really focused on how people interact with government services. And what we're really talking about is how people act within their own home. And so what I have got, I guess, the most interesting part of this presentation, what we'll move on to now, is different ways that can actually stimulate that change in behaviour, with the understanding that people are mostly operating in their fast brain system when they're doing these behaviours. So at ISF, we commonly draw on an approach from social practice theory, where we consider that behaviours are actually part of a system. So you have the physical, literally the physical system, or the environment in which the behaviour takes place. In our case, that might be the kitchen, where you have the different bins set up. That's the environment. Or it might be, you know, outside, where we use sort of wheelie bins, 240-litre wheelie bins, which people have on their property, and they fill them up during the week, and then, you know, on their particular bin day, they'll wheel them out to the street and the truck will drive by and pick them up. So these are the systems or the environment that people operate in. The second part of the behaviour system are the meanings that are attached to that behaviour or that surround that behaviour, and these could be individual, social and cultural meanings. And, you know, around recycling, you know, some of these meanings could be, oh, recycling's good for the environment, or it's okay if I buy too many of these things because at least they can be recycled. It could also be other meanings, like I said, you know, meanings around hygiene. It's not okay for these sorts of things to sit in my house very long, or I only make the effort to recycle when I know that it's going to the right place, but now that China's not accepting our recycling, all our recycling is going to landfill, so there's no point me sorting in the right behaviour. These are the meanings that surround this behaviour of recycling. And the third element is the knowledge and skills that people actually need in order to undertake a particular behaviour. So in this case for recycling, you know, that could be needing to know what material a product is made out of. Is it made out of, you know, compostable plastic or fossil fuel-based plastic, which is recyclable? Is it made out of paper, or is it actually plastic-lined paper? Is this product acceptable in my council or in whichever location I am right now? One of the challenges that we have in Australia is we are getting closer towards standardisation and harmonisation, but we still have quite big differences between what's recyclable in any particular council in the home versus what's recyclable in a particular business versus what's recyclable in public place. So there's a lot of knowledge that's actually required to navigate where am I and what's recyclable now. And then there are the rules which surround a particular behaviour. So, you know, these could be, you know, sort of big rules like it's illegal to dump rubbish or to litter, on the street. There could also be rules like a council saying, if you contaminate your bins 3 weeks in a row, we'll stop collecting them. But they're, rules that are actually enforced and surround the behaviour. And any particular behaviour exists inside this system. And understanding the system and the different elements that make up the behaviour can actually make it much easier for us to change that behaviour. And you'll notice, I talked earlier about kind of traditional models of behaviour change, and which are quite often information-based. They're about providing information. And that's definitely an important part of behaviour change. You can see that required knowledge is a key part of behaviour. But there's these other things going on as well. And it's one of the things we'll look at a bit more in detail in this, in the next few slides. So I'll start with the physical system. And like I said, this is literally the space that people are in when they're making their decision. And one of the things that's quite interesting is that the number of waste streams that a person is confronted with can actually impact how well they sort items into different bins. And in Australia, it's quite common to have just two streams, a rubbish stream and a commingled recycling stream. And our commingled recycling stream accepts, basically paper and cardboard, most plastics, most rigid plastics, hard plastics, food and beverage glass, and aluminium and steel. And in some cases, you may get, particularly in offices, you may have a separate office paper bin. In the home, you might have a rubbish bin, the red one, a recycling bin for your commingled recycling, and you might also get a garden organics bin for all your garden waste material. But what's interesting is that we've actually over the last 10 years moved to commingled recycling, where people can put all of the materials into the one recycling bin for a couple of reasons. But one of the reasons that's given is because this should make it easier for people to recycle, and therefore should make them recycle more. But what the research shows is that actually the greater number of waste streams that you have, the more effective people's recycling behaviours actually are. And there's a couple of reasons or speculations about why this is the case. And the first one is, going back to this system 1 and 2, that our knowledge exists in our system 2, but quite often we're working in system 1. But when we come to a situation like this, you imagine you've got a thing in your hand and you look at 6 bins. You can't necessarily just automatically know which bin your item is going into if you're not familiar with this situation. And so what it does is it actually triggers you to move from system 1 to system 2. Split-second decision, but what it does is then gives you access to all of the knowledge that you have about these different bins, and it actually enables you to think more consciously and therefore make a better decision. But the other thing that greater source separation does is it actually makes the contents of each bin much more specific and clearer. So if you have 2 bins, one is rubbish and one is recycling, your question that you have to answer is this item recyclable? But if you were faced with this particular situation, or say your curbside bins, this particular situation, you have an item in your hand, your question is, oh, is it paper? Is it food? Is it a container? It's actually a much easier decision to make when you've got greater streams. That almost the specificity of what goes in a particular stream or bin is actually enables you to make a better decision. And, one of the examples that we give, like I said, in Australia, we're quite commonly just a 3-bin system. So we might have our rubbish bin, our recycling bin, and our garden bin. We quite often put up this example from Japan, where they have at least 8 streams in their households, plus some additional ones on request. And they have very low levels of contamination. And so just an example of how changing the environment can actually change the behaviour without giving people any particular more information or engagement. Another aspect of the physical environment which really affects people's sorting decisions is how close different bins are located to each other. And this is kind of the convenience factor. So there's been some research, Sandra and I were actually just discussing that there's been some research in the US, which I'm keen to get my hands on, about distances in multi-unit dwellings. But there's been some research, at least on universities and businesses, that suggest that you need to have a rubbish bin and a recycling bin within 4 metres of each other. Otherwise, people will actually tend to put whatever they have in whatever the closest bin is. So 4 metres or 5 metres is like the magic number. If it's within 4 metres, people will walk that extra distance to go to the next bin. But if it's greater than 5 metres, they won't. So where your bins are located and where they're located relative to your other bins is really important in how people use those bins. And another example, one of the challenges that we faced here in Australia is that in our apartment buildings, a lot of our buildings will have a rubbish chute from, you know, whatever floor people are on down to the basement. But actually a lot of our recycling bins sit only in the car park basement. So every day people can take their rubbish bags from their apartment just down the hall to the rubbish chute, put them in. But they actually have to take their recycling in a bag, get in the lift or walk down the stairs all the way down to the car park and put it in the recycling bin. And because our recycling can't go in plastic bags, they actually then have to walk back up to their apartment, whatever bin it is that they collected their recycling in. And so we have major problems with our recycling because that convenience problem basically convinces a large number of people that it's not worth it. And so they put their recycling in the rubbish bin. Another example of how this works in practice and where changes to the environment can actually produce unintended consequences or perverse outcomes. One of the things that we were finding in commercial office buildings in Australia is that people were not recycling as much material as they should. So one of the changes that kind of gained popularity, became a bit of a fashion in the corporate world, was to give every employee a paper recycling bin under their desk. So it was right there. It was really convenient. And then what they did is they actually took all the rubbish bins away from the floor and they put them just in common areas around the, say maybe in the kitchens and in the printer rooms and things like that. And the idea was that the recycling bins are really handy, so people will use the recycling bins, but the rubbish bins are inconvenient, so people will create less waste, because when they create waste, they have to walk it to the kitchen. But what actually happened was that because the recycling bin was handy and the rubbish bin was not, people just put their rubbish in the recycling bin because their bins were too far away from each other and they weren't prepared to walk that extra distance. So another aspect of the physical system or the environment is actually how salient particular information is. And it's this idea of memory, whatever's top of mind when people go to make a decision. And so one of the things that can be really helpful is when you want to convey information to people, to do it in a way that's really memorable. So big facts about, recycling, we send, however many hundreds of thousands of tons to landfill every year, or, it produces hundreds of thousands of greenhouse gas emissions, or any of these really big facts or complicated facts are quite hard to remember off the top of your head. You might remember it was a big number, but you won't remember what the number is generally. But what you can do is actually take facts and break them down into small and relatable facts so that they become more memorable, so that when people are standing in front of their, in their bin, maybe they've got an aluminium can in their hand, aluminum can, and they're deciding whether they're going to walk over to the recycling bin or not, or they're just going to dump it here in the rubbish bin. Say, for example, they read that recycling one aluminium can saves enough energy to run a TV for 3 hours. You know, that's quite arresting for people, because you think the amount of energy that a big TV screen is kind of using to, you know, kind of blare this picture at us for 3 hours is quite a lot of energy. And one can is quite small, but if it can save that amount of energy, that's the sort of thing, that sort of fact that gets into people's head. And next time they're holding an aluminium can, they're likely to remember that. It's quite arresting and memorable. So increasing the salience of things so that when they're in system 1, they're fast brain, but the information that you provided them is actually top of mind, is one way to do that. And there's a number of ways to do that in the environment. So one of the examples is, this is kind of our typical rubbish bin. But what people have been experimenting with and found is that instead of having this kind of quite inconspicuous rubbish bin, if you replace it with a bin like this, bright red means bad quite often, symbolically, but it's also the cover of our rubbish bin, and it's clearly labelled landfill. It's very clear, whatever you put in this bin is going to landfill. That's quite a different decision for the fast brain, quite a different environment for the fast brain to make its decision in, deciding whether or not to put whatever we're holding in our hand in this nice friendly grey bin or in this warning landfill bin. So changing the environment in ways that grab attention can really change the way that people make these decisions. And this is kind of, I guess, similar to nudging. So nudging is this idea of making slight changes to the environment that actually provides subconscious cues to people about what is expected of them in a particular behaviour. And so you can imagine a situation where you're looking at 2 bins, and say you're holding that aluminium can and you don't know if it's recyclable or not. But if you were faced with a situation where these were your bins, it's pretty obvious which bin you would put the aluminium can in. Similarly, if you're holding a piece of paper, it's pretty obvious which bin you would put there. So without anybody telling you what goes in either bin, they're not labelled, they don't say what they are, you may not know what the colours are, but they're actually nudging you to do the right behaviour without changing what you know or what you think about things, how much you care about it. So similarly, these are the sorts of bins that people are actually trying to trialling in office buildings to try and help people make those decisions better, to nudge them, to give them subconscious cues to actually remind them what they're doing. And another really interesting example of this is one of the problems that we have a lot of in Australia is that people collect their recycling in plastic bags and they put the whole bag tied up in the recycling bin. And that's an issue for 2 reasons. One is actually there's a bit of a kind of a OH&S hazard issue with people untying these plastic bags because you can't actually see what's inside them. And 2, our machinery here is really not equipped to deal with plastic bags. And even where we have shredders, what we find is that it might shred the plastic bag, get the recyclables out it, but that loose plastic can then actually drop down and get inside the machine. So bagged recyclables in plastic bags, really big issue in Australia. And what some of the councils here tried is they actually literally cut holes in the top of recycling bins. So they literally got out the saw and cut a square hole in the recycling bin, just smaller than a kind of really full plastic bag, but still big enough to fit just about all our recyclables in. And what they found was that alongside a communication campaign that said to people no plastic bags, this was a really effective way at changing people's behaviour. They had tried just telling people don't have plastic bags, and you know, without too much success in getting rid of them. But when they did this, they didn't do anything else. They didn't lock the bin. They didn't stop people. People could actually lift up the bin lid still and put their bagged recyclables in there. But it was actually the cue, the reminder that plastic bags don't go in this bin. And another example of nudging or salience is seen some research talking about actually putting information about what goes in a particular bin on the inside of the lid. And this is an interesting idea because in Australia particularly, we either have them on the top of the lid or perhaps on the front of the bin as you're walking towards it. But what happens particularly with the bins, that when you're standing in the bins, you lift up the lid of the bin, and when you're standing there, you can no longer see the top of the bin or the front of the bin while you're placing things in the, putting your rubbish in the bin. But if the instructions are actually quite clearly on the inside of the bin, that's kind of literally in your face while you're using the bins. And that sort of placement of information can make a big difference to whether people are paying attention to it as they're doing a particular behaviour. So all these different ways of changing the environment can actually change the behaviour that we want without changing people's motivations, their awareness, their intentions to do the right thing. So I'm just going to take a break for a second, have a little bit of a drink. I'm rushing through this because I have so much great stuff that I want to share with you. Moving on to the second area is sort of the social and cultural meanings. And I assume this sort of stuff is fairly similar across most kind of places around the world. I mean, a lot of this stuff that's coming out of neuroscience, they're finding is pretty hardwired into the brain, regardless of where people are coming from. But one of the insights that this provides us is what's called social proof. And it's this desire that we have to conform to the people around us, whereby we look at what people directly around us are doing and let that guide our behaviour. So if we see people, putting the wrong things in rubbish bins, we tend to put the wrong things in rubbish bins. If we see people always doing the right thing, we're much more likely to do the right thing. And it's related to this idea, I guess, that we want to be part of a group. And so tapping into that desire to conform by either demonstrating social proof or social norms, the positive social norms about recycling, can really help increase people's kind of unconscious motivation to do the behaviour that they're looking for. And there's some really interesting research. So, for example, this is actually an example from tax. But what they did is they trialled a bunch of different letters that they sent out to people. And in that letter, it was the same letter, except that the 3 letters that are in blue had 1 sentence extra in that letter. It said 9 out of 10 people in your country or in your postcode or in your town pay their tax on time. And what they found is that just giving some evidence of a social norm that people pay their tax on time quite significantly increased the number of people who paid their tax. And the more specific or local that social norm was, so moving from a country to a more general postcode to a particular town, actually increased that effect. So if you have a way to communicate to your residents or your businesses, either that other people are doing this, social proof, or that it's expected that people will do stuff, which is the social norms, you're likely to see more people kind of trying to conform to that behaviour. Interestingly, one of the things that's been trialled here just over in Perth in WA, Western Australia, is clear bins, this idea of being able to see what goes inside the bin. And this is an idea that's come from a couple of places, but one of the ideas is that waste is largely invisible to people. We actually do quite a good job of hiding it, whether that's, in big black wheelie bins, which we don't see inside, whether that's vacuum systems that go directly underground. Waste is something that kind of disappears really quickly. And the idea of clear bins was actually to make it much more salient to people that they were actually seeing this and having to, face their rubbish. But what actually we found, we've got a lot of clear bins on our train stations. And what happens is social proof, social norms actually backfire when they're highlighting negative norms. So if you have clear bins and people are putting the wrong thing in those bins, you can see that, right? Because the bin is clear and you can see that it's a recycling bin that has food in it, for example. It actually encourages unconsciously people to not care and to put the wrong thing in because they can see that other people aren't doing the right thing. So social proof and social norms can be really, really powerful, but you need to make sure that you're always encouraging positive norms rather than highlighting bad things that people are doing. And so, like I said, social proof is what you can actually see people doing, and social norms are perceived expectations. And we, I guess like I said, we identify with the groups that we think we belong to. And this was another interesting example that was in the energy efficiency space this time, where they tried giving people information about how well they were performing compared to the people around them. And what they found was, when they initially did it, they just provided information about your energy usage and your neighbours. And people who were above the average did reduce their energy usage closer down towards the average. But people who were below the average actually increased their energy usage to still be average. So this particular company, OPower, it played around with a couple of different things, and what it found was that it could actually introduce this idea of social norms about not just what people are doing, but actually what's expected of people, by providing some additional information. So one of them was actually getting this class of efficient neighbours and comparing you to efficient neighbours by saying, you know, being efficient is a good thing. So even if you're below the average, you're still not efficient. And then they added this very clear signpost of expectations. And so what they could say was, if you're doing better than the average, or say, you know, better than the efficient, they could say you were doing great. And what happened was, when they added these smiley faces, it actually reversed the previous tendency, and people didn't increase to the average. They actually stayed where they were because they were getting this feedback that they were meeting expectations. So these things can be really powerful. It's interesting that they haven't really been trialled, at least in Australia, yet to recycling campaigns. But it's, I guess, one of those spaces where it's starting to see really great traction, both in energy and water efficiency. So it would be quite interesting to see it in resource efficiency and waste as well. So this is an example of where we are trialling social norms. These are bin tags that we use, and what they found is there's been quite a lot of research into how we can use bin tags, and they found that smiley faces are really effective. So using bin tags to communicate when people are doing behaviours that we want them to maintain, or when they're doing behaviours that we want them to change. What I'm really excited about is actually that the technology is improving, and I find sometimes in Australia we seem to feel that we're actually a little bit behind some of the technological advances, and it takes a while for technology to make it through here to Australia. But what we're starting to see is some really great technology that will hopefully be rolling out as our municipal authorities actually start to update their waste fleets, where the trucks themselves can actually monitor what is coming out of the bin and actually send that information in real time back to consumers. And they can actually get messages saying, your bin today had contamination, or your bin today was great. And I think when we get to that level of feedback, so that people are constantly getting that information about what they're doing and whether that's good or bad, you know, that would be a really, I guess, you know, effective means of providing feedback when technology can enable that. So I just wanted to really quickly touch on required knowledge, and then I want to stop because I definitely want there to be time for questions. But like I said, we tend to see knowledge as being necessary but not sufficient on its own. So it definitely is required that people have a basic level of knowledge in order to be able to sort this. And one of the things that we find is that a lot of our signage here in Australia is not particularly helpful. So these are really standard recycling signs that we use that are actually provided by some of our state environment authorities. And what they do is they actually highlight the really common items, the items that we actually already know are recycling. But they don't tell us very much about the items that are hard to recycle. So one of the ones that we have a lot of trouble with in Australia are coffee cups. Coffee cups are made out of paper, but they have a thin lining of plastic in them. They're also shaped fairly similarly to plastic beverage containers rather than to other paper packaging. So when they go to our sorting facilities, they actually quite often get sorted into the plastics stream, which they're clearly not because they're made out of paper. But even when they get sorted into our paper recycling stream, they can cause problems. But none of our recycling signage ever seems to have a coffee cup on it. So people stand at the bin going, oh, I've heard about coffee cups. I don't know if they're recyclable. And our signage doesn't tell them. So signage can be super important, but it is really important that it's communicated in a way that allows people to make sense of it. So here's an example of some signage that we've seen that are telling you what's recyclable. And, you know, it's got a lot of different things on there. It's got some, you know, more unusual kind of things. So it's actually telling you about phone books. It is telling you that you can put pots and pans in there. But it's quite a lot of information just thrown at you. Here's another example of a sign. So it's got some pictures. It's got a lot of text as well. And one of the things that the research has shown is that people don't take the time to read this sort of information unless they're really committed to doing the right thing. But a lot of people don't fall into that because they're in their fast brain mode. They're just trying to get their thing thrown out and moved in. And just to say that I'm not naming and shaming or pointing fingers at anybody, this is actually our UTS signage that we use here, and you can see it's really text-based. So, you know, it's something that's hard to get away from, the way that you think we should provide information to the way that it works. We did some, I guess, some research on different signage and trialing different things. And this is an example that we've come across that we've replicated here in a couple of our projects. And what we've found is that this sort of signage seems to resonate better with people. So it's got some really clear instructions on it. First of all, it's got really simple terms to help people understand, you know, which stream they're going in. The colours actually, so it's got actual pictures, so you don't need to look at text. You can find your item on there. It's got actually some common mistakes, so things that you don't put in the bin, which is really helpful. I can imagine in Australia, you know, we definitely have coffee cups down here. And it uses colours to actually relate to the bins. So you know that paper goes in the orange bin, plastic goes in the blue bin. So you can look at this and look at the bin and make a pretty good decision about where to go. And when we've replicated these in focus groups, we find that this sort of quite simple but comprehensive information really helps people make decisions really quickly. So just want to stop there. That was a huge amount of information just kind of thrown at you, and for different people on the call, it's either very early or very late at night, some of us in the middle of the day. But I hope that just gave you a bit of an understanding of some of the latest research that's coming out, that's moving away from sort of traditional information provision and looking at other ways that we can improve recycling behaviour. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. So I'll go ahead and make myself the presenter. And so we'll go ahead and open the space for questions. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat box, or go ahead and raise your hand, and I can go ahead and unmute your microphone. So maybe while people are thinking of questions, and Jenny, I did have a couple of questions for you. One of them is there a summary of these recommendations that maybe you can share with us?
So I've got the slides available, which I can definitely make available, and they've kind of got the notes in there. One of the challenges that we face is that we do our research on behalf of particular clients, and quite often our clients actually own that information, which is challenging. But we're hoping to release a bit of a report summarising some of the literature towards the end of the year. So definitely possibility to be able to, you know, get email addresses of people who are interested, or have them sign up to the ISF newsletter, and we will hopefully be able to release something, yeah, before Christmas.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a question from Sukriti Gupta, and actually from Ashish Sadiba. Sorry if I'm getting your name mispronounced. It says, do higher incentives for recycling drive people behavior change?
Is that in terms of, I guess, like financial incentives? There's some interesting research out there about how, particularly when you're talking about behaviours that are sort of linked to sustainability or environment, or they sort of have a moral reason behind them. What they found is that if you provide financial incentives to people to do these behaviours, you do quite often find a good response to that. But when you stop providing the incentive, usually the behaviour stops as well. So if you can't come up with a way where you provide that incentive continuously forever and ever, you often find that it stops when you stop providing the incentive. And interestingly, what seems to happen is the phenomenon they call crowding out. If you have a behaviour that people would normally do for a moral reason or an environmental reason, and you then pay them to do that reason, it actually undermines the motivation to do that behaviour in the first place. And when you remove the financial incentive, you can actually find that it actually drops back to below what it was before you started the incentive. And so that's where the challenge is, to look for incentives that are not financial, but maybe, a bit more reputational. Or one of the other things they found is that the way you provide the incentive can help create a habit. If you use things like lottery systems, or kind of, in psychology you'd call it a variable interval variable reward system, which is actually almost a little bit like a lottery machine, where people have the chance to win something or get an incentive when they do the behaviour, but not every time they do the behaviour, and it's not predictable. So they have to do the behaviour frequently, or a number of times to get the reward, and they never know when their next reward is coming. So there are ways to use incentives, but they are tricky. Is that sort of your question, I hope?
Actually, I have it, unmuted you if you want to go ahead and make sure that we. Oh, okay. So yes, they're saying that thanks for the detailed answer. Okay. Do we have any more questions? Let me check. Okay, maybe I'll just ask you one more question. Jenni, have you seen any studies that talk about how much time it would be appropriate to start educating the public before rolling out a recycling program?
It's interesting. No, I haven't come across anything that's kind of, I guess, looked systematically at that. Just, I guess, people's kind of rule of thumb in Australia, where they, I guess, have trialled and errored of different, over time. And what we kind of seem to find is that most of the municipal councils here would often start communicating between 3 and 6 months before the change happens, depending on how big the change is. But we've just had an interesting example here in Australia, where our big supermarkets have introduced a plastic bag ban just in the big supermarkets, not a kind of a government ban. And the retailers kind of gave about 2 months notice, and customers were just totally unprepared here in New South Wales. In Victoria, they're actually giving customers 12 months notice. So they've actually decided that there's a lot of education that needs to be done for people before they actually cut that out. So yeah, that would be really interesting to see if it's quantified, but I think it's kind of a bit more of a trial and error approach here in Australia.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions. One of them is, do you know if children are motivated from same behaviors?
Sorry, are children motivated?
I think the question is, let me go ahead and unmute the person so they can ask it. Hi.
I guess I was asking, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
Great. So I was asking, do you know if children are motivated using the same behavioral tools where you're introducing recycling as a new topic to them?
Yeah, so it's interesting. The research that I've seen has checked it with high school students in different things, but not with primary school students. But I guess the idea is that this is kind of generally how the brain works. I think probably primary school students could be different, because a lot of this rests on what you've already observed about your own behaviour and the world around you. And when you're younger, you've got a lot less time to have created habits and to understand what people are doing. So I suspect some of this would work when you're talking about making things memorable or salient, or actually putting cues in the environment to help people remember, like particular colours or particular bin lids. But some of the other insights, particularly things like social norms, you know, they might be a bit harder to apply to younger children. But you've just made me think of something that's quite interesting when you're talking about students. One of the things that we have a lot of here in Australia is school-based education for recycling, where you teach the children how to recycle with the idea that they actually go back home and teach their parents how to recycle. And one of the interesting things is that the research suggests that for a lot of people, if they learn how to recycle in school and they go home and they teach their parents to recycle, when they become teenagers, they all of a sudden forget about recycling. It's not quite as important. If their parents don't force them to continue recycling while they're a teenager, when they leave home, they don't bring with them what they learned about as a child. So that kind of school-based education works if the child can go home and, while they're still at school, change the way the whole household does it. But it doesn't last when they then become an adult if their whole household didn't change with them at the time.
So I had a follow-up question. So actually I'm working in India where recycling is completely new.
Yes.
And they are thinking of doing this exact model that you mentioned, where students will teach parents how to recycle in their own homes.
Yep.
And my question was, when you don't have social norms to encourage this behavior, then do you have any insights on how we can encourage adults to recycle when it's a completely new concept and waste has a very different meaning here?
Yeah, look, I know from experiences in Australia that one of the things that was actually really important, just because I was part of it when I grew up here, was this idea about social norms. So social norms you can either establish by showing that people around you are doing the same thing, or by communicating that it's expected. So you look at ways to kind of attach recycling behavior to other things, you know. So one of them, you know, one of the things is, you know, like, you know, good recyclers are good citizens, or, you know, good citizens are good recyclers, or, you know, that sort of thing, where you create this expectation or this kind of, you know, persona that says, you know, people who are recycling are doing the right thing. That's what we expect of people. And it definitely can work. And it can work really effectively, having children learn in school and go home to their parents, if you can somehow design the system, like you said, and it sounds like you're talking about this, to have a family-based incentive, so that the whole family has an incentive to do it, so that it persists once the person has left school.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sukripte, for your question. I think we don't have any more questions. We do have a comment saying that in India they have seen that at least 9 to 12 months of engagement or education is needed before driving a change. So they are also, I kind of agree with that as well. I don't have any more questions, so I think we can go ahead and conclude the question part of this webinar. And I would like to, before concluding, I would like just to inform you that the recording of the webinar will be posted on the Municipal Solid Waste Knowledge Platform, and here's the link for it. So please go ahead, and if you want to look at it again, or if you want somebody else to see the webinar, please give them this address, and then also just click here on webinars and you will find them there. I would like to thank you again for joining this webinar. Here are the email addresses of Jenni's and mine. So if you have any additional questions, please go ahead and email us. Please also go ahead and complete the exit survey, and also check on the knowledge platform for future webinars. Lastly, on behalf of the CCAC MSW initiative. I'd like to give a big thanks to Jenni for her time preparing and giving this presentation. I think it's a wonderful presentation, and I think it's a very important topic. And I hope that we get a lot of questions, and maybe that people start putting in practice some of the things that you talked about.
Thanks, Sandra.
Okay, everybody, well, have a great day, and hope to see you in future webinars. Bye-bye.